We come to our first interval, and our process of learning is an adventure. And in that adventure, there's an excursion into a continuity which has a classic segmentation. The classic segmentation is 12 presentations, and then a pause, and then another 12, another pause, and so forth, until we have 8 sets of 12. And in between the 8 sets of 12 are 8 intervals, which are like pauses. Those intervals allow us to have an articulation and to have the 12 segments available as a set which is capable of a number of proportions. One of the classic proportions is 3 sets of 4, where the 12 constitute the 3 months of a season, of a ritual year, of a cyclic year. So that 4 sets of 12 together, plus the 4 intervals, would constitute an annual cycle, a year. And this was the natural way in which our kind of species and dozens of species before us and millions of species before them acclimated themselves, because they were always emergent existentially out of nature. And this leads to the theme of this first interval, which is the Tao Te Ching, the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu. And it gives us a chance to let the first 12 presentations on nature have an articulate rest and acquire, in retrospect, the qualities of a set of 12, of 3 times 4, of 2 times 6, of 12 as a continuity, of 12 as a quarter arc of a circle, many different styles. Not just the 12 months of the year, or the 12 signs of the zodiac, or the 12 apostles. There are many different ways in which 12s figure, and 3s, and 4s, and 2s, and 6s, and 1s. So our excursion has the ability to bring itself into alignment with all the great wisdom structures of the world. And one of the deepest wisdom structures of the world is that a primordial set of 0 and 1 as a binary are capable of expressing almost anything to any degree of specificity. It's a curious thing that 0 and 1 should have that ability, and all of our computers today run on the binary principle of 0 and 1. And this goes back into ancient wisdom, actually. So our education has both a process and a form as 2 different modes that alternate. And the first was the process of nature. The second will be the process of ritual. And ritual establishes not right and wrong so much, not what is proper or improper so much, but ritual in its fundamental responsibility establishes existence. Existence is the most primordial unity that there is. In fact, it constitutes isness. To such an extent that what is only exactly that, because it is in a background of, Parmenides used to use a phrase that translates as is not. In the classic wisdom poem of Parmenides about the time of Lao Tzu in China, Parmenides, who had long white hair, looked like a William Blake sage. in one part of his mystical poem, On the Way, it translates very simply, what is, and what isn't, isn't. And they never mix, but they always meet. This was a great conundrum in classical Greece, and one of the most complex of all Plato's late dialogues is called the Parmenides. And the key to the Parmenides is that there is no way without a third man, without a third relation maker for anyone to understand the conundrum of is and is not. Now, there's a great deal of parallel between classical China of Lao Tzu's time and classical Greece. And it would help us to have just a little bit of Chinese background. When Chinese civilization first emerged as a dynasty, the classic date is 2205 BC. Some modern Western scholars have reduced that to 1989 BC, but we can take 2205 BC as a traditional date and understand something here. That first dynasty, so often referred to in scholarly works as phantom, the Xia, are instantly different from what came before. For the very first time in the China of the Xia, you find chariots. You find aristocratic princes riding in chariots drawn by pairs of horses. For the first time in China, you find jade as a deep symbol, and for the first time in China, you begin to find a confidence that there are large caravan routes that are available to them. And when one looks to see, why were there no chariots in China before the Xia? Because there were no tamed horses in China before the Xia dynasty. Where did those tamed horses come from? They came from the far west of Central Asia, and they came because they were the new beast of transportation for the civilization that had flourished in Central Asia, whose main wisdom figure was Zarathustra. And they're contemporaneous with the beginnings of the end of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, with the development of the Akkadian civilization of Sargon the Great, who established caravan routes of the Fertile Crescent, going one way, and also caravan routes going the other way, all the way to India, and on the Irani Plateau going up to Samarkand and Bukhara, and along the Amur Darya River, all the way into Central Asia, into the Gobi Desert area of China. And the farthest outpost that they had was the city that was the home of jade. This large contact, about 2250, 2300 BC, led to the founding of dynastic China. And with it came a confidence that there were many ways now relationally to see a wider humanity. The Xia dynasty fell because a new class of political military power came into being, and when the Shang dynasty took over to the Xia, they established something that was very grand in the sense that it was a powerhouse. The Shang established the fact that we now have our own source of power, and it is not to the far west or to the great caravan routes that we look, but to the fortification of our own power. And the Shang is very famous for hundreds and hundreds of years of setting up an indigenous power base. The center of it was around a city called Anyang in the fertile center of north-central China. the Xia dynasty had looked to find some ancient figure to base itself on in terms of understanding what is the celestial pattern and how does it apply to Earth, and that figure was Fuxi, traditionally about 2950 BC. And Fuxi is always called a dragon man. He's always shown paired with Nu Gua, his consort, and they have human heads and torsos ending in serpentine bodies, dragon bodies, a dragon man and a dragon woman, and their bodies intertwine much like the double helix, much like the Hermetic caduceus, much like the quality that here in a mutual coiling is a resonant interpenetration that leads to the establishment of forms that emerge out of the mystery of nature pure and whole. Nu Gua holds in some early exemplars, she holds a plumb bob to establish the center, the uprightness. In others, she's shown holding a compass, establishing the orientation. Whereas Fuxi holds a carpenter's right square, a L with a connecting bar making the angle, because when you know the center and the coordination and the angles, the squared, one can then build forms that are participant in the cycles of nature. And so man's forms not only hold because they are built right, they hold because they are real. Now, when the Shang dynasty came in, they ignored this early Xia ordination, and they changed the trigrams that Fuxi developed, which was a cosmological template, which was a compass and a plumb bob. The Chinese constellations have the Milky Way as a great dragon in the sky. And the Milky Way has a characteristic kind of a hump, and where the hump comes closest to Earth, if one drew a plumb bob down to the Earth at that time, when the Milky Way as a cosmological dragon is closest to Earth, the plumb bob would drop from the North Star, from Polaris. And that's where the ancient Chinese spring began, when you could drop a plumb bob from Polaris to the Earth, and at that point, one knew that your coordination in time was in accord with the Tao of nature. The Shang eschewed all of that, and they went into using Fuxi's methods as divination purely. And instead of using the trigrams, they began using tortoise shells, which they would throw into the fire, and then they would have magicians called sometimes Wu when they were shaman, or when they were court magicians, they were called Feng Shui, Feng Xia. And these court magicians would be the bureaucratic version of shaman, and they would do the interpretation of how the tortoiseshell divination would work. And so one passed from a cosmological early dynasty to a divinatory, military powerhouse dynasty. And when the Shang fell and a third dynasty came in, the Zhou, about 1150, 1190 BC, about the time of the Trojan War, the Zhou people reinstated their relationship with the Far West, with the Xia. They rejected the divination of the tortoiseshell, and they went back to Fuxi's trigrams and developed the trigrams into the complex hexagram system known as the Book of Zhou. As we would read the title of the I Ching today, it doesn't read I Ching, it reads Zhou. These are the symbols of the Zhou. And they are the symbols of the Zhou that harken back to Fuxi's changes. And so the cycle of primordial change from Fuxi was brought back into consonance at the founding of the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhou people, eschewing the brute military images of the Shang, characterized themselves as the bright new people, and the signal sign of the bright new people, as it was in Homeric Greece, was that they were the Bronze Age Chinese. They had beautiful bronze armor. They had beautiful bronze and jade ornaments, and they were the glittering new people who hearkened back to the ancient Far West and established again the center of China in ancient Xi'an. It was called Chang'an eventually in classic times, just south of the Wei River. Xi'an was placed, Chang'an was placed so that it was not in the Shang China of north central China, but it was on the other side of huge mountain ranges, so vast and long that the great Huanghe, the Yellow River, had to go north into Inner Mongolia and come all the way down and make a big L to go back and empty into the Pacific Ocean. And just there where that big L was, the perpendicular mountain ranges met together, and Xi'an was on one side, and on the other was a provincial capital, a franchise capital called Luoyang. And in between Xi'an, Chang'an, and Luoyang was a major road that went over a pass. It's called the Hankou Pass. And once one passed over the Hankou Pass, you were back into classic Xia Zhou China, back to the primordial China that looked to the magical, mystical west of the desert and beyond. Because ancient classical China, very much like ancient classical Egypt, they looked to the desert of the west to be the home of the mystical realms of paradise, the mystical truths. And for the Zhou Chinese, as for the Xia, they looked to a contact with a very special kind of people represented by a very special woman, the figure in China that carries the new Gua quality, and her name was Shi Huangmu. She is the Queen Mother of the West. And she had blue eyes. She was Irani, and she lived on a lake in Chinese, what is today Chinese Turkestan. And her great gift to the Chinese were the fruit trees and the flowers, just as the earlier contact had given them jade and chariots. One now had, especially of the fruit trees, the peach tree. And so the peach became the symbol of immortality as a gift of the Queen Mother of the West. After about 500 years, the Zhou dynasty began declining to such an extent that a warlord was able to actually ransack the capital city, and fleeing from this, the last remnants of the Zhou aristocracy went over the Hankou Pass and lodged themselves in 770 BC in Luoyang. And after that, everybody began to get into the act because a new metal began to make its way in China: iron. You can have the most beautiful bronze shield, a dirty iron arrow will go through it. You can have the most gorgeous royal breastplates, and you can be killed by a peasant shooting an iron arrow. And when iron came into China, in the midst of this Zhou decline, where its kingdom had shrunk to just being the territory around Luoyang on the Huanghe, the Yellow River, all of a sudden you had a new period in China called the period of the Warring States. and in the period of the Warring States for several centuries, China was in complete military chaos. Everyone wanted to be the new Shang. And finally, in 220 BC, a man came who reinstated the Shang big time, Qin Huangdi. And he said, everybody in this land from now on will be related to me and serving me. And so they became, for the first time in history, Chinese, from Qin Huangdi. And in order to show his power, he built the Great Wall of China. He rebuilt the entire military complex that the Shang had depended upon, only he forgot to include the very powerful aristocracy of warlords and generals that had for hundreds of years been used to having their own way. And finally, when Qin Shi Huangdi died, under somewhat questionable circumstances, after only about 20 years, all of these other figures came together and said, we are the new dynasty, not this man. And they established the Chinese Romans, the Han dynasty. And the Han dynasty lasted in its structure through all the vicissitudes of Chinese history. Even though the dynasty fell, its bureaucratic federal state with a feudal warlord oligarchy substrate within it lasted all the way until 1911, because the Han Chinese put the ostensible running of the empire in the hands of the Chinese civil service. And that civil service lasted until the times of Sun Yat-sen in the 20th century, unimpaired. No matter what dynasty was in power after that, they utilized the shell of the bureaucratic state. And in our time, we have seen that there is a great struggle in contemporary China not to go back and let a bureaucratic state be the tortoise shell, that instead there needs to be a different kind of a wide relationality that relates to the universe, that relates to the Earth being a member of the stars and planets, the sun and the moon. And so one finds the greatest struggle today in 2004 in contemporary China is the Chinese space program, which wants to go to the moon, to extend the everyday understanding that Chinese now don't just live in warlord territories, but they can extend themselves to places that warlords were never there. No emperor was ever there. And so one finds this great struggle going on today. Lao Tzu lived in the cusp between the Warring States period and the last of what was called the Spring and Autumn Annuals, the decline. No one knew at the time from 770 BC if they would ever get back. And so they began keeping all kinds of chronologies and records. And the gist of these chronologies and records were excerpted and put together and called the Spring and Autumn Annals. Spring and autumn being the equinoxes, it means the proto-history. And so the Chinese people, not yet called Chinese, were acquiring a proto-historical quality to themselves, not yet history. And Lao Tzu lived exactly at the cusp where that proto-history was beginning to come to a crisis which would result in the Warring States period. He was the archivist. He was the librarian in charge of the royal court in Luoyang. He was the librarian in Luoyang who had access to all of the great historical records. And when he had lived a very, very long time and had expanded his perspective so that he understood that the times in which he lived were not only falling apart, but they were falling apart faster and faster and heading for the crash which they had. He sought to go back to the original vision of Fuxi, going back to a primordial contact with the eternal. And so his book, the Tao Te Ching, is his long extended exclamation at the very end of his life of how it is that one goes back to the Tao and emerges from the Tao into the Te, which is consonant with the Tao. And that it is not a political form at all, neither feudal nor bureaucratic, neither imperial nor military. And he called this realm Te. When you come to the Tao Te Ching, it has two parts. The first part, in Chinese, it just says the former part concerns Tao, and the latter part concerns Te, and that they form this set, a binary, the 0 of Tao, the 1 of Te. And that with this set together, one has, in a constant flow of about 5,500 Chinese characters, no punctuation. The punctuation was added later. The division into 81 chapters is later. The original was an oral declamation which was written down traditionally by the keeper of the Hankou Pass, and his writing it down gives us an indication, because we see in our own developments elsewhere on the planet what this constitutes. For instance, in India, the first time that anything is written down is the Mahabharata, narrated by Vyasa, about 300 BC. Until then, wisdom was always ensconced to a living oral contact. There was no abstract middle ground of sacred books which you could consult on your own. The people participated in the sacred relationalities that were presented by the rituals and the symbols in the form of a living experience, and always it was an oral language that conveyed this. It is only written down when there is no longer the assurity that there's going to be a living continuity. In Plato's great dialogue, the Phaedrus, he records how in ancient Egypt, writing was designed by the original Thoth, the first Hermes, the forerunner, the grandfather of Hermes Trismegistus. And the first Hermes, when he developed writing and presented it to the pharaoh, he said, now men will be able to remember everything. And Plato, in the Phaedrus, has the pharaoh criticizing Thoth. Now that you have written it down, men will think that it is remembered, and they will no longer take the participation of their lives in their own experience to keep the flow of wisdom in a continuity and keep it alive. And so in China, Lao Tzu is the last figure who delivers the ancient Paleolithic oral tradition of contact with celestial, primordial, eternal wisdom. Because the figure that follows him immediately, in fact is contiguous with him, is Confucius. And Confucius is famous because he establishes the social order in written books. And when you read the written books, like the Lunyu of Confucius, the Analects, and we're going to be using the Confucian Analects to begin our ritual section next week. We're going to use the Analects of Confucius and Gladys Richard's Navajo Medicine Men sand paintings. We're going to use again a pair of books to establish that ritual has a very deep base. Its base is in existence, and it has different presentations. One, like in Confucius, existence is only possible if you humanize and order the existing power structure. the feudal lords ensconced in a bureaucratic social net. And only by supporting that with written documents do you have a chance then for everyone to learn, and not just a few intellectuals at the top. But when you read the Confucian classics, they are all about oral conversations. They're all about dialogues. Somebody comes to visit somebody, and the wise man has a dialogue with them. So that when you come to understanding Lao Tzu, one of the very first things that is written down is a book about 200 years after Lao Tzu. It's called the Chuang-Tzu. There are translations of the Chuang-Tzu, and there are beautiful little, the best translation, the one that I like to use, is the Complete Works of Chuang-Tzu, Burton Watson, Columbia University Press. And I also use the ancient version of it, the Chuang-Tzu, translated by Feng Yulan. This was printed in Shanghai, 1933, and translates just the first 7 chapters. What is interesting is that in Chuang-Tzu, who lived about the same time as Aristotle, he lived 369 to about 286 BC, and in his book, he has a meeting of the old Lao Tzu and the freshly matured Confucius. Now you have to remember that Lao Tzu by this time is very old. He's probably in his 80s or close to 90. The proverbial saying is that he was 200, meaning that when he delivered the Tao Te Ching, he was over 99. So you imagine to yourself, here's this wise, wizened, old man, and Confucius himself was dominating physically. He was about 6'5". He's called in Chinese lore many times the tall man. He was head and shoulders above almost anyone else. Like in our time, Mao Zedong was, when you look at him next to Westerners, he seems average, but to the Chinese of the day, Mao Zedong was very, very huge. When he was a boy, he used to eat beef all the time, sneak meat, because he wanted to be as strong as the Westerners. And he had a big shock of black hair. Mao means hair, that Mao. And he trained himself to be an athlete, especially in terms of swimming. And one of his prize achievements as an old man, Mao Zedong swam the Yangtze River to show that he could still cut it. Confucius was that kind of a figure. He was a John Wayne of China 2,500 years ago. And in this massive, quiet individual, I should use Gary Cooper more, tall and very quiet, but his wisdom was in being able to tease out of any interview the deep quality that interfaced with a social structure that allowed for its flow to be a complete ecology. Lao Tzu's flow was through the cosmos. Confucius' flow was through the social pattern. His understanding, Confucian China, is all based, if the social flow is complete, then it will be natural. Whereas Lao Tzu was completely different, and here's Chuang-Tzu saying, writing, Confucius had gone along until he was 51. That means about 500 BC, he was 51, and had still not heard the way. Finally, he went to pay and called on Lao Tan, Lao Tzu. "Ah, you have come," said Lao Tan. "I've heard that you are a worthy man of the northern region. Have you found the way?" "Not yet," said Confucius. "Where did you look for it?" asked Lao Tan. "I looked for it in rules and regulations, but 5 years went by and I still haven't found it." "Where else did you look for it?" "I looked for it in the yin and yang, but 12 years went by and I still hadn't found it." "It stands to reason," said Lao Tan, "if the way could be presented, there is no man who would not present it to his ruler. If the way could be offered, there is no man who would not offer it to his parents. If the way could be reported, there is no man who would not report it to his brothers. If the way could be bequeathed, there is no man who would not bequeath it to his heirs. But it cannot, and for none other than the following reason. If there is no host on the inside to receive it, it will not go. Host is not the best translation here. The word in Chuangzi means more like the traditional guest, the spirit guest. Who's one's spirit guest? One's spiritual sense of learning. The guardian spirit, the tutelary spirit. Because in the Paleolithic, it's only by the tutelary spirit that we can learn things that are eternal. Otherwise, all that we see is existence. All that we respond to is referential, existent objectivity. And that objectivity has come out of a wisdom which is not objective, but is still pure process. And in order to get to the pure process, one has to have a guardian spirit, a tutelary teacher, a spirit teacher within. Otherwise, there is no interface. We don't learn. And how do we learn by a guardian spirit? Because the guardian spirit generates the resonant sets so that we become acquainted with the harmonic before we are able to characterize it, before we know what it is, like a child learning language. They learn to speak long before they learn about grammar. And so it is this inner guest spirit that if it is not there, you cannot learn it. And so the only way in which a wisdom tradition is passed on is for your spirit teacher to be awakened and for the transmission to be direct. And so Chuangzi is famous in China because he is the root of Zen Buddhism. Out of Chuangzi comes the great meeting of the Tao and the Buddhism in Huineg about 630 AD. And in Huineg, you come together and you begin having the tradition that eventually fans out as Zen Buddhism. So here we have Chuangzi writing about Lao Tzu and Confucius, and some books, The Butterfly's Companion. One of Chuangzi's favorite little sayings is he doesn't know if he's a man dreaming he's a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming he's a man. Another is called Wandering on the Way, earliest Taoist tales and parables of Chuangzi. So that the interview snippets, the dialogue snippets, become the parables. And the parables are centered around a saying which encapsulates the seed. Very much like the Gospel of Thomas are the sayings of Jesus, they're the seed. And if you develop the seed, you come out with the parables. And the parables are found in the Gospel of Philip. And then once one has the parables, you can fill out the sermon. And the sermons are in the Gospel according to Matthew. And so you have the seed and the parable and then the sermon. The three corners are established, and the fourth corner should be apparent to you, the man. But not just a man, the spirit man. Let's take a break. Part of what we're investigating is learning how to learn. And what we're seeing today from an ancient wisdom tradition is that you begin before you begin. It's like a really great dancer is in motion before their body begins. Or someone who has a tremendous consciousness will have the space of the insight already vibrant, already dynamic before their mind begins to think. That way, then, motion is a continuity. it doesn't begin with one, it begins with zeroness. And if it begins with zeroness and has continuity all the way through, no matter where that continuity finitely leaves off, it doesn't end. It just leaves off, and the resonant vibration goes into an infinity. So that form has an Aikido process of context to it. And what we're doing here with this learning is we're shifting learning from scholastic instruction that fits into all kinds of other groups' programs and reinstituting what Lao Tzu or Fuxi or many sages around the world have always done, and that is to convey reality into life. One of the figures in classical China who was named Yang Chu was a hedonist. He was like an Chinese Epicurus. He had this Epicurean quality that no one is ever going to understand anything and you die. So live the best life that you can. And all of his works were destroyed except for one chapter that was slipped into a Taoist work called the Leizi. And it was excerpted in 1912 here by Professor Anton Fork, translated Yang Chu's Garden of Pleasure. And the basic thing here is that there is no reality that is available to us other than the fact that we live and we die, and we can make life better. In Chuangzi, Yang Chu was the butt of a lot of deep criticism in the great follower of Confucius. His name was Mencius. And Mengzi always was criticizing Yang Chu because there is intelligence, there is understanding, whereas Chuangzi, who was a contemporary of Mencius, exposes him to the evaporation of Lao Tzu. No criticism necessary. In the 7th chapter of Chuangzi, this is the Feng Yulan translation from the early 1930s. Feng Yulan was a brilliant young philosopher, and he was sent from China to study with John Dewey at Columbia in the United States, because John Dewey had been sent from the United States to China in 1923 to spend a sabbatical year there. The China of the early 20s was always inviting people to come and teach, and the year before Bertrand Russell had gone to China and taught. And then he got ill, and so when John Dewey and his wife Evelyn got to China, the first thing they did was to take care of Bertrand Russell and nurse him back to health. And all the Chinese just loved the fact that here are two completely different kinds of Western philosophers, and yet Dewey's humanity was paramount. And so Feng Yulan went to study with John Dewey. And later on, the Chinese intellectuals of the 1920s were all taken with John Dewey and Dewey's pragmatic qualities of education. And not only Feng Yulan, but one of the great Dewey-influenced men in China was Hu Xie. And here is the Chinese Renaissance, the Haskell Lectures, 1933. And there are great critical studies of these figures. Here is a book published by Harvard, Hu Xie and the Chinese Renaissance, Liberalism in the Chinese Revolution, 1917 to 1937. Here's Feng Yulan's translation of the section where Chuangzi exposes Yang Chu to the evaporative expansion of Lao Tzu's presence. Yang Chu went to see Lao Tzu and said, "Here is a man, alert and vigorous, clear-sighted and intelligent, and untiring in learning Tao. Could he be accounted a wise ruler? In comparison with the sages," said Lao Tzu, "such a one would be a mere servant or artisan, toiling with their muscles and wearing out their minds. The tiger and the leopard are hunted because of the beauty of their skins. The cleverness of the monkey, the sagacity of the dog bring them both to tether. Can such as these be compared to a wise ruler? Yang Shu looked discomposed and said, "May I venture to ask about the government of the wise ruler?" "In the government of the philosopher king," said Lao Tzu, "his achievement is the greatest in the world, but it seems not to be his own. His influence reaches all things, but no one depends on him. No one can give him a name, but everyone enjoys themselves. The philosopher king is he who stands within mystery and makes excursion into the non-existent." This is putting the space of reality before any movement occurs. And the philosopher, sage, king puts the space of Tao there for everyone before any of their actions begin, so that all of their actions together are choreographed in a network of continuity. And even though they don't know that it has already the conscious space to begin in, the resonance of the network of all their choreographed activity resonates into infinity. When Lao Tzu was periodically brought back into play, it alternated. Sometimes he was brought back into play in terms of magic, which became science, alchemy. Or sometimes he was brought back into play where his anti-political anarchism was the seed of all kinds of social experiments. And sometimes he was brought back into play, like the founding of the Tang Dynasty, as the great, deep wisdom that was necessary for life to be there. And in the Tang Dynasty, what developed out of it was not just Zen Buddhism, Chan in China, but the whole idea of Chinese astronomy became paramount at the time. There was a great history of Tang astronomy written by a fellow who was just loving all kinds of beautiful Chinese things. His last name was Schaeffer. He wrote The Golden Peaches of Samarkand and a number of things. But his history of Tang astronomy is called Pacing the Void. In order to see stars as constellations, one has to let one's consciousness link them together into constellations. This goes back primordially to the beginnings of constellation astronomy with Zarathustra about 2200 BC. In order to see stars grouped together as a constellation, and the constellations related to each other in a tapestry, one has to have the visionary consciousness between the stars. The void has to be factored into the stars together. And while the stars are the dots, they're not connected geometrically, they're collected relationally, so that they form sets of visionary patterning. And all over the world, one finds again and again very similar constellations put together with remarkably similar names. I remember once the great New Zealand Mayan expert Peter Balland, who did the Mayan tarot deck, who was from New Zealand, and when he visited into Israel and found that the ancient plumb line of the central constellation of the ancient heavens was actually El. And that God goes back, that God image in the celestial realms goes back to several thousand BC. He got curious because he was from New Zealand. What was the constellation over the other pole of the earth? And in the ancient Polynesian cosmology, that star constellation is that of the porpoises, and in Spanish it's called Dorado. So that the polar axis through the Earth, for two completely different mythologies, is El Dorado. There is a deeper wisdom than schools teach. And it's not just that it's hidden, it's that it must be put together not just creatively, but through an expansion of consciousness into the zeros and infinities. And if they are brought in together, then that essential binary set begins to be operative everywhere. And one can then, with that kind of attraction, correlate everything from mystery through symbols of the mind to science to art to everything. And that's what this education is about. We're about to expand literally into the stars. Nobody ever established kingdoms or empires there. And so we have to learn again how to be relationally free with the dynamic spaces of consciousness that have gone out ahead of the movement, which we will most certainly do. And while that movement will have a social quality, its social quality will be a movement in vision and history more than in the mythologies of experience. One good thing about vision is that it is affine as consciousness to becoming a dimension of nature. And nature, instead of just being four-dimensional, is five-dimensional. And that five-dimensional, quintessential, conscious time-space is exactly the calibration of the energy cycles of Taoism, the five-phase energy cycle. In Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, one finds the energy cycle presented in the 42nd chapter. Here is my translation of it. And each of the chapters in the Tao Te Ching were given little titles. The first person to make titles for sections of the Tao Te Ching was a sage who lived along the Huanghe, the Yellow River. And so his name was just taken from the river, and his translation and commentary was published in Ascana, Switzerland in 1950. And so here's Ho Shangkun's commentary on Lao Tzu, probably from around the 170 BC era, from a sage who lived along the Yellow River, Ho Shangkun. And when this is translated, here's my translation of the 42nd chapter. Tao produces unity. Unity produces polarity. Polarity produces trinity. Trinity produces the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things bear yin to embrace yang. Zhen, even if detested, is exactly orphaned, widowed, a hermit. Kings and nobles thereby exact it for their honorific. So sometimes you lose itself and gain, sometimes you gain itself and so lose. Zhen is presence, even taught. I also teach this presencing. The strong and aggressive ones resonate only death. Transcendence thus conveys Te, founded learning. What happens is that one, unity, oneness, one, emerges pristinely whole. And yet, that whole is not the beginning. In Philo of Alexandria, Hellenistic Jewish wisdom from about 30 AD, he says on the contemplative life, he says God is more primordial than the one. This is a sense that if one throws a dynamic energy into play consciously, time, space will occur out of that pristinely whole and exact to any degree of specificity. If you get so many 10,000 angstroms, you'll have orange light. If you change it by just a little bit, you will begin to get a vermilion light. The exactness is on any degree of specificity. If you have so many megavolts, you will get an electron. And it will like to go around a nucleus of protons and neutrons and occupy energy shells of exactness. And if there's one electron missing from the last shell, the entire structure of the molecule of which that atom is a part will be ionized. And that ionization allows for an interpenetration of elements and of molecules, and so the universe builds its forms because the openness is taken into the constellation of its reality. And so part of our understanding is that the zeros and infinities must be constellated in our reality, or there is no way to have adhesion within ourselves, adhesion within the next level in China is the family, and then the village, and then the kingdom, and then the whole, it was called in ancient classical times, the Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo. The Middle Kingdom, because it is the place where the understanding of the center line and of the compass and of the squaring allows for Tao and Te to work together, and that Te existence always emerges exactly, pristinely unified, and because the oneness can be written 1 over 1, it means that all relationalities of wholeness carry Te with them. And so all proportions that are possible, all relationalities that are possible, all resonances will all have a calibration which is exact, sets which are finitely complete, and a harmonic that will characterize their interaction between form and process. And so we find that before chapter 42 is chapter 41. And chapter 41 is entitled due not only to Ho Shang Kung, but due to a later commentator. He only lived to be 23, and he's one of the intellectual giants of history. His name was Wang Pi. And Wang Pi's commentary about 225 AD is one of the great documents in the world. Absolute genius. He says that the chapter title reads, and my translation of his 2 phrases in Chinese, identity and rightness. Superior listeners hearing of Tao are disciplined, practicing presence. Average listeners hearing of Tao sometimes keep, sometimes lose it. Inferior listeners of hearing of Tao in a big way ridicule it. If not ridiculed by them, not really Tao. Therefore, in language say, bright Tao resembles dark, advancing Tao resembles returning, straight Tao resembles the indirect. And so one finds a predilection in Chinese it's called the Tao Te, the school of Tao, the discipline of Tao. That uniqueness is a signature of the real. And so you'll find in the Tao Te a predilection for gardens that have very unusual rocks, very unusual plants, unusual roots, unique, one-of-a-kind objects and things to remind one that though it has only happened once, nevertheless it is real. It has happened. And from this comes another saying, and the saying is a Taoist one, that the sage has square pupils, that his eye, whenever it looks to see, sees in composition. Because conscious time-space is always given not only its space of emergence, but given its form of Te, of unity, of actuality. Confucius shunted this to a slightly different presentation. His saying is, sageliness within, kingliness without. You can have the square pupils on the inner eye, but you must have the round pupils to deal with the real world, that of the social order, that of the feudal powers. You have to respect the corporations, they own us. You have to respect the social norms, they have the laws, the jails. You have to work with what is there, but you can still be wise within and interface with what is there and thus find a proportional wisdom. Whereas Lao Tzu says the proportion is not in just the Te, but it's the proportion of the Te and Tao as a set. So he says, superior Te resembles a valley. Most ample Te resembles non-sufficiency. Established Te resembles the non-finished. It begins before the beginning. It goes on resonantly after you've finished. The very simple resembles the dumb. The biggest perfection has no shame. The biggest square has no corner. The biggest container has no completion. The biggest sound has no modulation. The biggest form has no shape. Great Tao, empty of name, exact Tao begins completion. Meaning that the cycle of energy occurrence has a completion, but its completion is there with return. The 10,000 things, if they are natural, are absorbed by the Tao, but because the Tao is already zero, infinitely full, the absorption instantly reoccurs in their iteration again, exactly as they are freshly from the Tao now. And that this happens so quickly, billions of times per given time unit, that reality is never static. It's always vibrationally iterative in its sets of energy occurrence. And so to be wise in life requires something like this. Chapter 40, going back one more, is called Avoiding Function. Returning is Tao, presence, movement. Yielding is Tao, presence, function. Heaven and earth, the 10,000 things, resonate by existence. Existence is consonant with the empty. And so you find in the Tao Te Ching, increasingly, that there is this really deep quality. And here, at the beginning of the section on Te, you find the same kind of initial calibration that you found in the initial section on Tao. I put about 15 pages of additional notes on the Tao Te Ching in our presentation notes. When you're able to get a set of these, it's about 125 pages this time. I'll have them by next week. The very first chapter of the Tao Te Ching is on Tao. The 38th chapter is the beginning on Te. And they both begin with a cadence. Chapter 1, every other character is Tao. Chapter 38, every other character is Te. And it sets up almost like a drum beat that whatever is said in this character, immediately it is ensconced in the character for Tao. And then another character of something is put out, it is immediately absorbed by Tao, so that you get the beginnings of the small ecology that will turn out to be the whole five-phase energy cycle, so that it reoccurs in every iteration of every existential all the time, all the way through all the levels that there are to the cosmos as a whole. Here is the translation made in 1898 by young D.T. Suzuki, made in Chicago of all places. His Zen master in the 1800s was Shoin Shaku, and when D.T. Suzuki, who was a young language genius, when he was 21, he was invited by Paul Karras, a German philosopher, had gone to Chicago like Franz Boas in New York, and drew all kinds of people together and set up a publishing company and a school. The publishing company was called the Open Court Publishing Company. And he wanted to make a translation of the Tao Te Ching, but he didn't know Chinese, so he had to have someone who knew Chinese and knew English and could come and help him make a translation. And the 21-year-old D.T. Suzuki was chosen. His Zen master said, "You cannot go to Chicago unless you have had your first satori, your first experience of enlightenment. I'm certainly not going to send you to the Chicago of the industrial big shoulders of America without you being at least one time enlightened." And D.T. Suzuki said that he just couldn't make it. Nothing would happen. And finally his teacher said, "Well, then you'll have to kill yourself. You have 3 days. You either have your experience of satori or you harikari." And Suzuki, crushed by this, late in the evening on the 3rd day, gave up. And as soon as he gave up, he said, "I walked out of the Zendo," and he said, "In the night I looked, and everywhere I looked, all the trees were transparent. And I looked down at myself," and he said, "I was transparent too." He related that story when he was 95. So he came and made this translation, and this is how the beginning of the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching begins. Tao Kuo Tao Wei, Chang Tao Ming Kuo, Ming Fei Chang Ming, Wu Ming, Tian Ti, Qi Shi Yin Ming, Wan Wu, Qi Mu. The reason, Tao, that can be reasoned, Tao, is not the eternal reason. Tao Guo, Tao Fei Chang Tao. Ming, the name that can Ming be named, is not the eternal name. So in the first beginning, you have just a few characters that are choreographed and arranged together so that they constitute what later on in Zen Buddhism became the sound of one hand clapping. You oppose a character that has a te cognate with a character that is cognate with nothing, Tao. And so what you have is, instead of the characters coming together to make a referential, you have only one character that is suspended. And when one gets used to the fact that you see the suspended characters making a constellation out of pure nothingness, all of a sudden you wake up. That wisdom is not about learned instruction, it's about discovery that behind the learnedness is something that you just now freshly found because it's just now freshly real. That it wasn't there before. It's there only because you are cooperating with it, and now it is really first time there. And so it's called the Pristine World. It is transparent because it is purely fresh every single time that one comes to it in that way. And getting used to it, one lives in fresh life. The living word. Here's how the te begins. Shang te bu te shi li yu te hia te pu shi te shi yi wu te shang te wu wei wu yi wei. It translates superior te is un-te. Therefore, it has te. Inferior te, not loses te. Therefore, it has no te. Superior te is non-action, and it has not thereby pretensions. In other words, there is an option available. You can go into pretense, or you can be in the real. But the real, the Chinese saying is, heaven suspends its emblems. They float in pure void. The space between the stars has no lines connecting them, has no referential meanings that you can look up, has no structure of law that you have to consult and then obey. Heaven suspends its emblems because the constellations of the real are there only when you cooperate with them and you are part of them. Your seeing of them consciously makes them constellated at that moment. And you are a part then of every gestalt that is real. Wherever you look to see, freshly now, there it is. And not there because you assumed that it statically was there. One of the great Zen masters, Ikkyu, famous for a little Zen koan, he said, "The rose is not red, the leaves are not green. Beware, beware." This is the way in which the beginning of chapter 37 is translated by me. It's titled, by the way, 37 is the end of the Tao and the prelude to the Te. 37 is entitled Busy Governing. Lao Tzu is very much an old sourdough wise guy, and he is always criticizing people who are busy pretending. And they are so busy pretending, they are never real. And even with someone real, their response is, well, I don't understand them at all. They're not pretending like we are. And they're not busy at all. Well, they can't be worth anything. Busy governing. Tao, eternal, non-doing, yet nothing, not done. Knights, kings, if they can keep this, the 10,000 things will of themselves transform. Transform, yet when desires stir, calm by non-name presence, uncarved. Non-name presence, uncarved, in phase, will not desire thereby still. Heaven, earth being absorbed. One of the great classics in Chinese history and literary development is the Wenxin Tiaolong, and it means the art of literary carving of dragons. It means that a literary art is able to carve dragons so that the dragons are suspended in the Tao. And one of the great Chinese forms of this ancient long poem called the Fu. And the Fu are famous in Chinese literary history, and one of the greatest, summarily great geniuses of the Fu was the poet Li Po. And when he was young, when he was about 21, he was about the age of D.T. Suzuki. And Li Po was a very special Chinese because he had blue eyes. Because of this, he felt he was descended from the Queen Mother of the West, and because his name, family name Li, was like Lao Tzu's family name was Li, that he was related to Lao Tzu, just like the emperor. Tang Tai-tsung's family name was Li Shengmin. And so these figures, founding the Tang Dynasty and being the greatest poet in Chinese history, looked to Lao Tzu to understand and be together. And in his great Fu, Li Po gives us a prelude to all the great poetry that would come after him. One of his most famous little lines runs in translation like this: I am like a bird that has flied south so long that I now fly north. It's not just a reversal, it's an inside out going into the space. More next week.